Welcome to Proles of the Round Table.
Hello and welcome to Proles of the Round Table, where we sit down, have a few drinks, and talk Marxist history. Check out our website at prolespod.com, where you can find our back catalog, links to all the resources we talk about, and a whole communist ebook library, along with a few recipes. If you want to extra support us, check out our Patreon, where you can give your hard-earned wages to a bunch of sectarian tankies in exchange for bonus episodes, clothes, and content. Find out more at patreon.com/prolespod. We wanted to thank this episode's primary sponsor, who enabled us to pay the mortgage on the luxurious Proles pad. Big thanks to our sponsor, the Democratic Socialists of America. Today with us, we have Colette. Thanks for coming on. How are you doing?
I'm doing really, really well today. Thank you so much.
Good. So I guess you want to give the people at home a rundown of what you're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about, broadly speaking, democracy in a socialist context. So we're going to go from understanding democracy from a historical materialist perspective, and then we're going to go into how proletarian democracy has been implemented in revolutionary states and within parties in the form of democratic centralism.
Nice. So, as always, I'm Jeremy, and I'm drinking Death Before Disco Porter from Left Hand Brewing, employee-owned Left Hand Brewing. Was actually started as a capitalist company, and then the owner, when he retired, basically gave the company to his employees, which is
nice.
As far as like what capitalists can do, pretty solid move. Also, to my left, I have...
I'm Drew, and I'm also drinking Death Before Disco.
That's weird.
Yeah, it's quite the coinky dink, if you will.
All right, this is Justin, and I'm drinking Bourgeois Tears.
Mm-hmm. Also known as water. So, Colette, are you drinking tonight? Or?
Oh, yes, I am.
Oh.
So I have with me a Washington Gold cider. It was the only cider made with Washington apples available at Walmart at 1 a.m. when I do my grocery shopping.
Fair enough.
So, and I am not going to go on Proles of the Round Table and drink cider made from inferior New York apples. I'm going to drink cider made from good, hearty Washington apples.
You're gonna split the listeners of Proles of the Round Table. Gonna get death threats from New York. So I guess just where do you want to begin?
Right. So in order to understand democracy from as it has been implemented by revolutionary states throughout history, we first have to understand democracy in a historical materialist framework. So I'm not going to give an intricate history of what democracy is like from Athens to now.
Sure.
Because we could be here for hours.
Right.
So broadly speaking, democracy as a word means control by the people or run by the people, right? So factored from that, you have bourgeois democracy and proletarian democracy, because those are the two classes that run shit, right?
Sure.
So within bourgeois democracy, the dominant tendency within that is what is most often referred to as liberal democracy or parliamentary democracy. It's the dominant form of government in most bourgeois capitalist states.
Sure.
It is control of a state by the legislature, and how that legislature is elected varies from state to state, but broadly it's a representative form of government, which means that it's not going to necessarily be proletarian.
Right.
On the proletarian side, there's a couple of different ways that is branched out over the course of history, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. So liberal democracy, we're not going to really go into that much because that's a whole history, and this isn't the history of bourgeois democracy.
And most people are pretty familiar with, bourgeois democratic, liberal democratic states, as most of us live in those places,
Yeah. So democracy from a socialist context is democracy is the proletariat runs shit, and not the bourgeoisie. So, oh boy. The first example we really have of this system being developed in a real life situation outside of a theoretical situation is in the Soviets of pre-revolutionary Russia, little s Soviets. So Soviet in Russian just means council,
right?
Or assembly. Like it doesn't necessarily imply an explicitly leftist usage. It just means council,
right?
And the purpose of Soviets in the 1905 revolution, when they first had their big trial by fire, was they were essentially glorified versions of trades union councils, where you would have representatives from the different factories and farms and unions kind of congregate in an assembly in, say, Petrograd or Moscow or whatever city, and they essentially operated as a parallel government. And in the 1905 revolution, the aborted January Revolution, they directed strike actions. And even though that revolution failed, it was a perfect test to kind of hone the skills of the Soviets. And then when 1917 rolled around, they were ready to actually take the final push and basically carry out the world's first socialist revolution. So at this point, Lenin has pretty thoroughly laid out in what is to be done, and around this time, if I'm remembering correctly, in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, kind of what his idea of democratic control looks like.
Sure.
Not just in a state or in a local assembly or whatever, but within the organization. And this is where we get democratic centralism from. So democratic centralism and Soviet democracy come around at around the same time, and they're heavily influenced by each other. So this might be a good time to pause on the history and go towards the theory aspect of democratic centralism. So democratic centralism is the application of Marxist method to the question of how best to organize the working class in the revolutionary transformation of society. It embodies two elements, democracy and centralism. There is no formula for the perfect proportion of these two things. That is to be determined by the communists of that time and moment and place. That's on their shoulders to kind of determine okay, what's the level of centralism we need? What's the level of democracy we need? So the democratic aspect ensures effective decision making, right? So it includes thorough discussion of all questions, full airing of minority viewpoints, collective decision making, periodic reviews, reports from the membership, criticism of all aspects of political organizational theoretical practice. It rests on the principle that collective decisions made by majority vote after a full, informed, and frank discussion are more likely to reflect the interests of the working class than decisions made without such a discussion. So this kind of lays to rest the really popular idea among non-Marxist Leninists that democratic centralism is inherently oppressive, that there's this sort of tyranny of the party line, and that there isn't really any discussion, and that if you voice any sort of opposition, you're expelled from the party. That's like completely counter to the purpose of democratic centralism in the first place. Like, Lenin explicitly makes it clear that the minority viewpoints need to be heard. Like, in order for the discussion to truly be democratic, everyone needs to be able to voice their opinion. The difference between this and what I will discuss later with horizontalism is that once a decision is made by the assembly, it's expected that everyone follow that decision.
Mm-hmm.
Debate stops once a vote is taken. And that's where centralism comes into play. Centralism is necessary to ensure unity in carrying out decisions, to provide strategic and tactical flexibility, to create the basis of social practice for evaluating the organization's line. It basically means that leadership needs to be effective, efficient, not bureaucratic, always listening to the other members, and responding decisively to guide the organization and the working class through the twists and turns of revolutionary struggle. So those two things put together form democratic centralism, and Lenin lays this out as like the basis of organizing in any revolutionary party, and that gets taken into the real world and applied as Soviet democracy. So Soviets operated on a very similar practice, that decisions were thoroughly debated. Like, the idea that Soviets were these tyrannical, like, almost like dictatorial. I mean, they were dictatorial, but not in the way that people think they were.
Sure.
Like, these sort of like oppressive assemblies where no one really got to voice an opinion or anything is completely false. And we will see that. We will see that later when we talk about how the USSR operated under Stalin. So that's like the guiding principle behind revolutionary organizing. So there's a couple of places where democratic centralism can go awry. These two tendencies are more Maoist terms, but they're very, very convenient to explaining the two problems that can occur here. So the first one is called commandism, which is what happens when you have an extremely bureaucratic leadership that basically takes the place of the membership when it comes to making decisions about the party. Leaders command, members become employees. Don't ask me to take any responsibility, I just work here kind of mentality. Commandist parties quickly tend towards dogmatism. Party congresses become rubber stamp affairs. They're like, the democratic aspect basically withers away. On the other hand, there's what's called ultra democracy, where there's basically no guiding leadership, where the membership just kind of always is in a state of debate and always in a state of like discussion, but never really makes decisions, and the decisions they do make aren't ever really effectively carried out. So you have to balance the democracy and the centralism so that you don't tend towards commandist bureaucracy, but you also don't tend towards anarchistic ultra democracy. So
do you feel like the transition to like the theory of democratic centralism was made the Soviets more effective in terms of being able to respond to the revolutionary conditions in 1917 as opposed to 1905?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And we will see during the Civil War what made them, that's what ended up like pushing them towards being successful.
Nice.
Enter 1917. The next year begins the Russian Civil War. And the Russian Civil War really sees two models of proletarian democracy not pitted against each other, but their feet are held to the fire. You have the democratic centralism of the Bolsheviks and the anarchist democracy of the Makhnovist Black Army. And it could not have been a more divergent tale of two systems. The Soviets miraculously weathered the Russian Civil War, despite the fact that it's in a period of war communism. So all surplus food and resources are going straight to the Red Army, going straight to the war effort. So there's like severe rationing. There's there's a lot of starvation, not because of problems by the Bolsheviks, but because they're in a period of war against 18 imperialist countries.
Right.
And then you have the anarchists, who are bunkered down in the southern parts of the Ukraine. And for this, I'm going to turn to probably the most unlikely source that I would have ever found for a good look at what the anarchist Ukraine was like, which is an article from the International Socialist Review.
Hey.
Yeah.
Worse things have happened. Whatever.
Yeah. Quote, clearly conditions were not right for egalitarian socialism, let alone the statelessness of communism. But anarchists ignored the objective difficulties facing the revolution and proffered Makhno as the valid alternative. The Makhnovists made two attempts at organizing production along anarchist lines. Both were centered at their base of operations, Guliai Pol. The first in February 1918 lasted 3 weeks before the Austro-German invasion destroyed it. We know little of this experiment. Makhno's own memoirs barely touch on the political and economic organization of the communes. Instead, he spends most of the time discussing eating arrangements.
Basically what I do too. So.
Makhno ignores all the key issues for describing a society's workings. Dark writes, there is nothing on social relations of production, on the division of labor, on crop selection, on the labor process, on marketing, on the distribution of surplus. Simply 300 undifferentiated anarchists and peasants in a communal canteen taking a day off whenever they felt like it. And these few weeks in spring were to serve as the basis for a social revolution, end quote.
Damn. That was harsh.
There was a second attempt, which lasted a bit longer, about 6 months, and they were run a little bit better. But the problem with the second round was that they were very, very small and represented a very small proportion of even Ukrainian peasants. And the thing to know about the anarchists was that they were almost entirely peasant-based. Makhno was extremely disdainful of workers and especially of cities. He had like some really nasty things to say about cities. He called them a poison. His vision for worker and peasant relations was based on barter between the two. And the Makhnovists also relied heavily on just plain old banditry, which leads us into kind of an interesting confrontation that happened between Trotsky and Lenin, because Trotsky is the Red Army commander at this point. Right. And
never heard of him. Low energy.
And he has a divergence of opinions with Lenin over the Makhnovists. Lenin wants to maintain the tenuous alliance the alliance between the Black Army and the Red Army was never very solid in the first place. It was always extremely tenuous. Lenin wanted to maintain that because he saw the anarchists, as flawed as they were, as a bulwark against the White Army in the Ukraine,
Sure.
which was making some really pretty amazing progress. So he wanted to maintain that alliance because he felt that the Red Army needed all the help it could get in the Ukraine. Trotsky wanted Makhno arrested and shot. Because Makhno was leading basically pirate raids on Red Army supply trains, stealing loads of bread that were meant to go to the front. Makhno, because the communes were failing, just simply resorted to simple banditry to help maintain his army. They eventually flip-flopped several times in terms of who they were supporting. They were allies of the Reds and then went to the Whites and then were neither and helped both. The thing I want to draw away from the Makhnovists is that their idea of democracy absolutely failed. And as scientific socialists, if we're to believe that revolutionary theory needs to be practiced and tried and experimented with, and then have some modicum of success for us to update our theory to include it, that doesn't work when it comes to the Makhnovist experiment. The Ukraine was, compared to the Soviet model, a complete and abject failure. And that's an important thing I want to make clear, because even today we're still kind of dealing with this battle between Marxists and anarchists, and the anarchists are still very much clinging to this immediate statelessness that has been tried before and hasn't worked. We have definitive evidence, primary source evidence of that this was an abject failure, and yet we're still having this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like anybody who's arguing for entryism, or people who are arguing to try to steer the Democrats to the left, or engage in electoral politics, fighting for a bourgeois party, but trying to get left-wing candidates elected. These are things that have all been tried in the past, and they have all failed repeatedly. It's not, there's there are successful revolutions.
Yeah.
You can look at those, follow their patterns.
The Russian Civil War is also a really good example of the failures of entryism, in that the Mensheviks outright just sided with the whites. Back when the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, split into the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, when the Civil War came, the Mensheviks just outright sided with the imperialists. It was pretty much immediate. There was a party, though, called the Socialist Revolutionary Party that also had a split into left SRs and right SRs. And the right SRs joined the whites, but the left SRs kind of formed this tenuous relationship with the Bolsheviks in the interim government, and they were essentially trying to do this kind of DSA type shit, and it didn't work. And then when October rolled around, most of them just defected to the whites. Some of them sided with the Reds, but a lot of them just went to the whites. So this idea of, well, if we just participate in bourgeois parties and try to effect a revolution from that, that's been tried before.
Sure.
And that didn't work either. So the Civil War, the Russian Civil War, is really interesting because there's not a lot written about it. The bulk of Lenin's writings are from before 1918 and after 1921. So there's kind of in terms of primary source theory, the Civil War is kind of a blank spot, which I guess kind of makes sense if you're leading a war against 18 other nations.
Right.
But in the sources that we do have, it's really interesting because it's the moment when all of these diverging ideas of how revolution was going to be affected were experimented and were tried. And the only one that came out not worse for wear was Soviet democracy. So when we enter 1923, we have the first Soviet constitution. So after the revolution, the constitution was sort of like ripped to shreds. It was like a mass undoing of all of these czarist laws. But that wasn't really like a new constitution. The first new Soviet constitution was in 1923. And the way it was written and the way it was structured had a lot to do with the political atmosphere of the time. So there were people who were explicitly delineated as, the word doesn't translate well into Russian, and I don't have the word in Russian off the top of my head, but it's something along the lines of people who didn't have certain privileges. These were mostly people who had been members of the bourgeoisie before the revolution, members of the nobility, members of the clergy, people who had been cops, like literally people who were Tsarist police officers were explicitly listed. And actually, like, the term police officer was so hated that they just end up making a new word.
Nice.
And post-revolution, police officers were called militiamen. Police officer was not outright banned, but like it was extremely like verboten to call someone a police officer because that was the Tsarist term for that.
Right.
So these people didn't just like lose voting privileges. They also couldn't be members of communes. They were restricted to what jobs they could work. They had basically like a reduction of rights, which again is another point of, well, so much for, socialist democracy. If like we're just going to start excluding people based on their class relation, well, post any revolution, would you want to give the people who you just overthrew back their power?
Probably not, in my personal opinion. I mean, you definitely, want to keep an eye on these people because they have a vested interest in, overcoming their very recent, shall we say, bitterness about the situation and returning to, their original class position, which I think is like, kind of sort of somewhat understandable. So yeah, you should totally, keep an eye on them.
Yeah.
In my personal humble opinion.
Noted.
So part of why the Constitution delineated these people was that these were also the NEP years. So there was sort of like this 7-year long experimentation with a mixed market economy that allowed for some like very like minimal privately owned business. Most of them were state-owned private businesses, if that makes any sense, or like partial ownership, a lot of like private co-ops, because the purpose of the NEP was to basically infuse the USSR with foreign investment cash,
Right.
Because they were trying to rebuild after like an apocalyptic civil war. And when I say apocalyptic, there were people in Leningrad, not then Leningrad, it was still Petrograd, who were like ashen gray from like being like only eating like 350 calories a day.
Yeah.
So like there was a lot of rebuilding that had to be done. So they had to do kind of like this mixed market experiment for a couple of years. And like because of that, they put certain restrictions on who had what rights, because they didn't want this like artificially created capitalist class to get too out of control.
Mhm.
Which
And they did to some degree. I mean, we saw a bit of that
Yeah.
in the like Soviet cinema episode that Ethan did.
Yeah.
Like all of the production studios and directors and whatever, they kind of dicked around and like stole a bunch of money from the Soviet
Oh, yeah.
government and like, yeah.
So, like, the NEP was very much a mixed bag. It did what it needed to do, and from that perspective, it was a success, but at the same time, it meant kind of like this artificial recreation of a petty bourgeoisie that
Right.
ended up having to be liquidated a few years later.
Hey.
So the system of Soviet, we're getting there. That's going to be a bulk of this episode. So the system of Soviets, little less Soviets, in the 1923 Constitution was pyramidal and indirect. So in 1923, the various SSRs, the various like satellite states. I kind of hate that term
Right.
because it kind of implies that they were kind of like colonies. I just refer to them as like
Sure. Allied
the
republics.
other
yeah.
republics.
Neighbor states. I don't know.
Neighbor states, yeah.
Yeah, so before 1923, during the Civil War, the Russian Civil War, calling it Russian is kind of a farce because every one of these republics had its own civil war, and in some places it lasted for longer than others. So in 1923, a lot of these new Soviet republics were like, we're really small and we're really militarily weak. We just came out of fighting a brutal civil war, and we really don't have the resources to put up with a counter revolution. So let's like
Right.
assemble ourselves into a union, and that way we can all kind of mutually benefit each other, and hence the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was born. It was a completely voluntary union of 15 autonomous states that decided we're going to form this sort of like mega confederation for mutual benefit. So most of the republics comprising the USSR were, for a period after October 1917,
Sure.
they were independent, like completely. But in 1923, elected to associate themselves with the other states to compose the USSR, simply because they felt themselves in danger of attack and wished to pool their economic and military resources. So that way, like the smaller republics, like Armenia and like the Caucasian republics, and some of the more sparsely populated SSRs, like the Stans, they could benefit mutually from the military and economic support of larger states like the RSFSR and the Ukraine and Kazakhstan and whatnot. So the book that it's not really a book, it's more like a pamphlet that I'm drawing a lot of this information from, is like one of the best finds I have ever found on the internet. It is a pamphlet from 1943 written by a British guy who was living in the USSR at the time. And he wrote this book basically explaining the entirety of the Soviet system in about 60 pages for the contemporary British audience. And it's extremely like easy to read, extremely relatable. And like, so during this pamphlet, he's like comparing and contrasting like the USSR and the UK and like what they do different and what they do similar. And it's like amazing. I can't believe more people haven't read this, and it's definitely going to be a resource that should go in the show notes.
What's it called?
It is called The Soviets and Ourselves, Two Commonwealths, by K.E. Holm, which is a pseudonym. I don't know who K.E. Holm actually is, but that's who it's by.
Nice.
And he basically like explains everything. He explains how the constitutions work. He explains how the Soviets work. He explains how planning works. So like, this is going to be like my big primary resource for like the nitty gritties of certain parts of Soviet democracy. So the 1923 Constitution outlined the rights of the Union republics. They acquired the right to diplomatic representation overseas, to organize national military units, to have their own flag, to have their own culture, to have their own anthem. And Stalin was really big on this. Can't imagine why. It's not like he was from a tiny Caucasian republic. He was really big on the right of these nations to national self-determination. And during the NEP, there was a strong push towards like fostering these local cultures. That was scaled back during most of the 30s, mostly because centralization was required to prepare for the war effort. So the Union republics lost, I mean, I wouldn't say lost because they got most of it back. They kind of like a lot of those, like, let's foster national, like, culture and like identity were kind of like scaled back in favor of we are like a union together, kind of because they needed to foment unity in order to prepare for the inevitable war against fascism. So in that regard, there was like some oscillation between how much leeway a Union Republic had with where it could develop. But the Union Republics, other than that, were relatively like autonomous. And actually, so were most Soviets. The more I read about how Soviets functioned in both the 1923 and 1936 constitutions, like everything that every libertarian socialist ever has said that they want in a system existed in the USSR, which is really strange. Like in the 1923 Constitution, Soviets, like local village Soviets, could basically do anything they wanted as long as it didn't go against the decision of a higher Soviet, which gave them lots of autonomy that to municipalities and like bourgeois capitalist states would be completely unthinkable. And the only difference between the 1923 and 1936 constitutions in terms of the pyramid structure was the method of voting. So 1923 was indirect. Your local Soviets elected the representatives to your Oblast Soviet or your Rayon Soviet or whatever the next highest stage was. And then the members of that Soviet elected higher, and then the members of that Soviet elected higher. So it was like this indirect voting system. The 1936 Constitution, which again was encouraged by Stalin, took away that. Universal suffrage was instituted, which abolished the categories of like people who had restricted rights that was in the 1923 Constitution. And it also made all voting to Soviets direct. So everyone in a local Soviet would elect their members to their Rayon Soviet all the way up to the Supreme Soviet. So like Stalin made things more democratic at like almost every turn. Like no matter where you look, like at some point Stalin was trying to figure out some new way to make the Soviet Union even more democratic and give even more rights of determination to the local assemblies. There's a document by one Grover Furr from 2007. So this
What
is
was that name again? What was that?
One Grover Fur.
Hmm.
One Grover Fur. Gotcha.
No idea who this guy is. Never heard of him before.
Sounds like a street name when you say it like that.
So he wrote this article in 2007 called Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform. When I put it all into a document, it's about 57 pages long, which is pretty sizable. And it basically outlines like the history of Stalin trying to further democratize the USSR, and like how he was constantly rebuffed at every corner.
Sounds authoritarian.
Yeah. Which is like the polar opposite picture of the one that we get, right? This idea that Stalin was like this brutal autocrat, that there's no basis for that. This, and of course, it being Grover Fur, it's meticulously sourced, and all of his sources like come from the Soviet archives, or the secondary sources he cites got their information from the Soviet archives. So like there's nothing left up to chance here. And it's just the wildest saga. You had Stalin advocating for multi-candidate elections, which was thoroughly rejected by the first secretaries because it would have encroached on their power. And like it was those first secretaries that would like seek to further cement their control in the party. And I bet you can name who one of those first secretaries was.
It wouldn't be a Khrushchev, would it?
It would.
Oh wow.
He was one of the most staunch opponents to all of Stalin's democratization reforms.
That's weird.
Which is a portent of things to come. And so Stalin, after the 1936 Constitution, kind of gave up the fight until like the last years of his life. So the 1936 Constitution didn't have multi-candidate elections, but it did have direct voting, and it did have universal suffrage. The universal suffrage aspect was also incredibly unpopular with the first secretaries. But they were the ones who lost out on that battle. So to give you an idea of how, like, taking an issue that would have been extremely common in the USSR in the 1930s, the easiest one that comes to mind is, how does central planning work? Like, this is like the biggest conundrum for a lot of people who aren't well versed in Soviet, like haven't studied the Soviet system much, because this idea of central planning is that there's like a bunch of people in a dark room who come up with like a bunch of numbers and just spit it out and tell people this is what you get, this is what you have to do, or else. So planning was an extremely laborious process. What essentially would happen is Gosplan, the State Planning Commission, would come out with a preliminary draft of what they thought, you know, the different Soviets were capable of doing. And they would, in this document would be like 1,000 pages long, literally. And it would get sent down the ladder from the Supreme Soviet all the way down to the factory and collective farm assemblies. And at every stage along the way, the assemblies would get together and make edits to this document and say, we think we could produce this, we don't think we could produce this. And then they would pass it down the next rung on the ladder. And then it would go all the way down to, like, as I said, the collective farm and factory assemblies. And then when they were done with it, it would go all the way back up doing the exact same thing. So it would go back to the local Soviets, and then the Rayon Soviets, and then the Oblast Soviets, and all the way back up to the Supreme Soviet until Gosplan would get back this ginormous document, which they would then digest into the 5-year plan. So The
That sounds really democratic.
It is.
And unlike anything in liberal bourgeois democracy.
It is so democratic.
Yeah.
They made sure to get the voices of damn near every worker in the Soviet Union before they came out with this plan. And that was obviously intentional. The universal electorate in the USSR did a great deal more than just elect. It had incessant meetings for hours. It would pass resolutions by the hundreds of thousands. Like, it would have endless debates. And I mean, like, it was like the hotbed of democracy in the world at that point. And it's just like the peak of like privilege, I guess, to say, well, that's not true democracy because it doesn't work the way that I think it should.
Yeah.
So how workplaces worked. So like workplace democracy. The IWW would have loved the Soviet Union. Workplaces were owned by the workers, not like in terms of like the workers literally owned their workplaces, but like the workers like had control over their workplaces. They could fire their boss, which is like the most mind-blowing thing to me ever. If a worker had a problem with their boss, they could write to Pravda and it would get published in Pravda, and then that it was the onus was on the officials to investigate that. Like every accusation against a foreman or a boss had to be investigated. And like if a worker was fired, the other workers could retroactively like reverse that firing. They could say, we think that's wrong, we're going to like reverse your decision, which is kind of like a popular veto.
Nice. Yeah, that's cool.
Collective farms operated somewhat similarly, obviously a little bit different than a factory would because you're growing food and not necessarily producing material. But essentially there you would have your quota from Gosplan, and you would kind of like divvy up among yourselves what you thought each worker was capable of producing, and then that's how you got paid. You were paid not necessarily by how long you worked, but like how much you produced versus the amount that was set for you. So like if you produced twice as much as that was benchmarked for you, that was really cool, and you would get a little bit of a bonus for that. You got to keep all of your surplus. This idea that they're destroying food, they had to destroy all of their surplus. That's in capitalism. It's capitalist agriculture that has to destroy its surplus.
Yeah, the dairy farms did that a couple of years ago.
They do it with fruit all the time here. The orchards in the Cascade Mountains, like there's just piles of rotting fruit. That's like the most depressing thing known to man. But like in the Soviet Union, like surpluses were divvied back to the collective farms. So like you could divide that produce among themselves, or you could sell it on the open market and then take the proceeds and distribute that equally. So like there was like your surplus was going to benefit you in some way, whether it was like food or whether it was going to be cash for like new amenities, new whatever. So there were farm meeting assemblies at least once every 2 weeks, and determines by majority vote how much of its produce will be distributed as dividend after deliveries to the state have been completed, and how much should be put into capital investment or cultural amenities like a club, a library, a children's creche. And like we have agendas from these farm meetings. So in the Timurazov collective farm in the province of Gorky, the following items appeared on the agenda of the collective farm meeting during 1941 and the first 6 months of 1942. Rate of payment of members, 15 times. day-to-day organization of work on the farm 14 times, personal needs of collective farmers and supply problems 13 times, raising labor discipline 12 times, stock breeding and fodder 12 times, training and an appointment 11, acceptance of new members 8, long-term planning of work and contracts with state organizations 7, checking up on fulfillment of Gosplan orders 6, protection of crops and collective farm property 5, finances 5, by industries 5, sheep rearing twice, cultural work twice, and miscellaneous 6 times. So like we have agendas of these meetings, and like we can tell exactly what they discussed, how they voted on things. There were nearly 250,000 collective farms in the USSR, and that produced basically all of the USSR's agriculture. And they fed people. We have, as has been mentioned on many a Prole episode before, CIA documents saying that Soviet citizens ate better and more than Americans. So, like, this system worked. Farmers.
What you're saying is basically the USSR was good, actually.
Yeah, amazing. Like.
In every way.
Wow, okay, statist.
Like this pamphlet and like reading how the Soviet Union actually functioned just like cemented for me personally like how well this system works. Like finding primary sources on how these things worked is really hard to do, partly because that information is intentionally kept from people. It's a miracle I was able to find this. I found this on like the web archive, and it was like in a half readable format. And it took a lot of editing for me to get this into a state that like I could give it to people and people could read it. So like if it was so hard to find this, imagine how much harder it is to find like anything else about how the Soviet Union functioned. And that's because it's intentionally kept from people.
Yeah, I mean, if you Google Joseph Stalin, Grover Furr's works are not going to come up. Like it's going to be, it's
going to be Kotkin.
Right. It's going to be Wikipedia, and then it's going to be like Time Magazine, and then it's going to be like articles trying to compare Donald Trump to Stalin, and then somewhere down the line you'll find a Kotkin biography
and Applebaum,
and
So like payment is made on lines as similar as possible to the piecework system that prevails in most factories. So the system was similar but had to be adapted because they're producing different things. The basis of the system is the labor day. So the labor day was how much you could produce in a day. And then your payment was determined based on if you went above or below that. And like an idle or unskilled worker may find a labor day a comfortable day's work. So like a worker who has like who has like physical issues and can't work as much, or a worker who gets tired easily, like a labor day is like, oh, this is something I could do in a day. And they'll be comfortable getting paid for a day's work. A good worker may be able to perform 2 or even more labor days in a single working day, and he'll be paid accordingly.
Wait a minute. Wait one goddamn motherfucking second here. So what you are trying to tell me is that socialism actually rewards hard work?
Yeah.
Holy shit. That's amazing.
Sounds like a meritocracy.
And for the workers who went above and beyond, like really above and beyond, they even had their own name attached to them. They were called Stakhanovites, named after a coal worker that may have actually existed, or he may have just been kind of like a John Henry, Paul Bunyan type character, who like purportedly like overfulfilled his quota for the day by like 256 times or something like that. And so like
Staccato. Like I really want one of those like 1960s like cheesy Hanna-Barbera style animated cartoons about this like worker who did
Yeah.
256 times.
Let's get
He's
on
just
it.
like,
Yeah. We need more communist animation.
yeah.
Unironically though. So like because of Stakhanov, like workers who went above and beyond their quotas were called Stakhanovites, and they were like considered like paragons of society. They were not held up above everyone else. Like they were not like treated as like, you know, better than everyone else, but they were like kind of like celebrities in that this is like this is a good example of a good worker. Someone who goes in and does the work that they can for the benefit of our USSR. And that's really beautiful to me.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the reason I say that the Wobblies would have loved the USSR is that unions in the USSR were organized industrially. So every industry had its own union. It was not craft unions, like basically dominates unions here. And unions are incredibly important in the USSR. In the USSR in 1940, of about 30 million wage or salary earners, over 25 million of them were organized into unions, which is like most.
Sorry, could you run those numbers by me again?
Of about 30 million wage or salary earners, over 25 million were in unions. That's
about 83%.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Partly because union membership in the USSR was incredibly important. Unions were how you got a lot of your work benefits, in terms of like, if you wanted cheap theater tickets, you would join a union. If you wanted cheap vacation spots, you would join your union. It's not like those things were inaccessible if you weren't in a union, but being in a union made life a little easier. And those things were kind of like incentives to get people to join the union. The more important functional role of unions in the USSR was that unions were who would negotiate how much wages were. So wages, as we've already kind of discovered with collective farms, wages in the USSR do not mean what wages mean here. Wages are not, we're going to give you so many rubles per hour. There's a pool of money that the state sets aside for wages, and then the Central Council of Trade Unions negotiates with the government the wage pool for each industry, and its distribution within the factory is negotiated by every factory's union committee. It's rather like sharing out a dividend. So it is kind of like so the USSR's economy did kind of function like a giant fucking co-op.
Call Richard Wolff.
Yeah.
I want to hear about
Wait
this.
a minute.
I want to know.
Hold up a minute.
Did he just say the Bolsheviks are right wing?
The factory committee supervises and controls managerial costs, as well as looking after the conditions of work of its members and inspecting workshops for safety and hygiene. And its most important job is, again, one that seems odd to British trade unionists: the administration of social services. There is no Ministry of Labor or National Insurance in the USSR. All labor legislation is drawn up in consultation with the trade unions. Sick relief, insurance, free holidays, maternity and funeral benefits, creches, canteens, cheap theater tickets, all of these are administered by trade unions for their members.
How did that work for those who were not part of a union? Like,
it was harder. So like those things weren't impossible to get. Like everyone had healthcare if you lived in the USSR. Like no one went without healthcare. The unions just made it easier to get on the healthcare plans. Old age pensions are granted at 60 years of age to male workers who have been in employment for 25 years and at 55 to women who have worked for 20 years. These pensions amount to 50 to 60% of previous average earnings. Workers who do not wish to retire at the pensionable age do not thereby forfeit their pension. So if you wanted to work longer, you totally could, and there's no penalty to that. There's no means test. Sickness benefit during absence from work is 100% of your average earnings unless the worker is declared totally incapacitated, in which case he receives a pension calculated as a proportion of his previous wages. Medical treatment is free for all. And then I love this quote. There is no unemployment benefit, as since 1930 there has been no unemployment. Yeah, real air horn hours.
Wait a goddamn minute here. What you were trying to tell me
that everyone had a job.
Everybody had a job. Wow. So, but I thought socialism made people lazy.
See, the funny thing is that when you get like 120 some odd million people to all get on board with the idea of working together for the benefit of everyone, people aren't really as lazy as you would think.
Wild. So basically what you're trying to tell me here is that, like, when people work for the benefit of their society, they directly see that benefit in their communities and in their own lives, as opposed to just, like, you know, basically making sure that your boss can buy a better Maserati next year. Yeah. They're going to work harder?
Yeah.
Wild.
Yeah.
It is very strange.
I don't know. I don't know about all this.
I know it's some really like radical shit going on here.
Yeah, this is wild. I don't know. Anyway, my apologies. Please continue.
It's hearing, like, reading all of this for the first time was a really big thing for me, because this was like the first time I was reading a firsthand account of how the USSR in the 1940s actually worked. And it was like, holy shit.
Yeah.
It was really a galaxy brain moment. Yeah. Like, this was like, I think for me, this tiny pamphlet was one of the things that finally pushed me towards, like, becoming a Marxist-Leninist after a year of being like this weird, like, right Bukharinite kind of thing. Like, this was like seeing how beautifully this functioned is what made me like, yeah, like I'm on board with this 100%. This is good. This is good kush.
I mean, and that's kind of how it's been for me with a lot of things, like a lot of little things sort of opening doors and like giving me little insights into things that I previously believed being completely wrong. And, you know, like I think Lenin's letter to the American working man was a really big one for me, because at that point I was still considered myself a libertarian socialist or whatever.
Yeah.
And like there were lots and lots and lots of little tiny, because it's a very short document, like I think 10 pages or 15 pages or something. And there's a lot of little tiny points that really undermine the notion of democracy within a like bourgeois country, within a bourgeois nation, and how, you know, the media within bourgeois nation will call, you know, what goes on. He was referring to the Red Terror, and he said, you know, the bourgeois media will refer to us as terrorists.
Yeah.
Know, but you know, what of their terror? What of their imperialist terror? Their wars? You know, in which all of these working people die. How is that not terror? How is that not terrorism? And I was like, you know, and things like that. But there's lots and lots and lots of those points that I've hit, and I'm looking forward to reading this document, to be honest, because it sounds enlightening.
Like, the author is no like principled Marxist-Leninist. he makes a couple of he's very idealistic. He makes a couple of points that, like, when I was editing, I'm like, because he's an Englishman from the mid 20th century.
Right.
And that comes with everything you would expect it comes with. His conclusion made me cry because it's just so poisonously optimistic. Like, he's just so convinced that the post-war is just going to be like this glorious future for humanity because the UK and the USSR teamed up to beat up fascism, and they did, and now they're best friends, and we're going to go into this with like an enlightenment, and it's just going to be a glorious future for humanity, and everyone has so much to learn from each other. And like the last couple of and he closes out the document with a quote from Gerard Winstanley, who was a English communist from the English Civil War in the 1600s. That's like really inspiring and poignant, and I'm like, this is gonna make me cry. So like, those things taken aside, it's a very well put together document.
Voting just worked like basically like via secret ballot, right?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Originally, yeah. Originally, no. Back when Soviets were like these sort of like ad hoc worker assemblies, voting was done by show of hands, which was replaced by secret ballot in the 1936 Constitution. So the 1936 Constitution is really like the maturation of Soviet democracy. It's like it's like saying, so we're going to move to this more structured stage of democracy rather than the sort of ad hoc stage that it was previously. And a lot of the democratic processes, as I mentioned before, are thanks to Stalin, who really, really, really pushed for like the most democratic parts of this constitution. Democracy and the right of the Union republics were like his two biggest pet issues. And he was pushing for further democratization in the USSR literally up until the day he died. And so in the power vacuum between Stalin and Khrushchev, you had Beria, who I personally detest, for reasons that I'm sure many people know that I don't really want to bring up right now.
Yeah, I think we're all aware of who they were.
Yeah. But Beria took over in the power vacuum after Stalin died, and for a very brief moment, he undertook a lot of the democratic reforms that Stalin had been wanting to do. And then Khrushchev undid all of them. So it doesn't really end up mattering in the end. But there was this weird like year and a half, if even that, where like we saw some of what Stalin was pushing for become reality. So the last thing I want to talk about before I move on to other examples of socialist democracy is the relationship between the Communist Party and the state, because this is a huge topic of misunderstanding. There's very much this idea that's been pushed in the anti-communist bourgeois media that in order to be anyone in Stalin's Russia, you had to be a member of the CPSU. You had to like be a party member. Like you had like the party was like it, and to be anything, you had to be in the party, which under Stalin is not true at all. So the relationship between the Communist Party and the state apparatus was what I would describe as tied together, but also parallel, if that makes any sense. Like they were intrinsically connected to each other, but they also operated parallel to each other. The party was a separate apparatus from the state, but the party had influence on the state and the state had influence on the party. So there was like a symbiotic, dialectical, if you will, relationship between the Communist Party and the state apparatus. So being a party member was big shit. because party members were expected to be like the leaders in their workplace, the most upstanding people in their communities, like the role models you looked up to, the people you could go to if you had a problem. Like basically
basically, my apologies, but basically, like, from what I understand, it was actually more of a burden to be a member of the CPSU than it was like a privilege.
Oh yeah. Privileges were scant. That makes the idea that the being in the party like made you part of this new like elite clique, this new like caste, is just full of horseshit, because there was more pressure put on you to be a member of the, like, as a party member than any benefits you got in return. Actually, if anything, party members were like limited in pay to the average earnings of their workplace, because they were expected to be like the example, and they didn't want their members thinking that they were some like higher kind of worker. They were just like everyone else, but they were kind of also meant to be a leader. And to do that, like, they had to live by there was like a strict kind of like, not like a moral code, but also kind of, they were expected to like not be drunk. They were expected to not carouse. They were like not.
We're fucked.
No, kidding.
I think I'm going to delay that application to the party if that's okay.
Like, so there was like a very, very like tense understanding of like what being a party member was. And it was like, you had to have like recommendations, and you had to go through a probationary period. Like, it was big shit if you became a party member. Not in the way of like you get all these cool perks and benefits, because you didn't, but because like that meant that like you were now expected to be a leader. Like, you were expected to be like an important leader that people could look up to and trust in your community and your workplace. So because of that, being a party member was not for everyone, by any means. There were like a lot of party members, but also like the percentage of the population who were members of the Communist Party was not anywhere near as high as people think there was. And because of that, the relationship between the party and the state was not as like unilateral as people think it was, because it wouldn't make sense for a party that was extremely hard to join to also have massive influence over how the state functioned. So it was more of a symbiotic relationship. The party had a parallel structure to the state. So the state had Soviets, had the pyramid of Soviets. The party had a pyramid of its own. And so they were parallel to each other, and they also worked with each other. They informed each other. They helped guide each other, because the Communist Party is the vanguard party. So the Communist Party helps lead and inform the direction that the state takes. Enter Khrushchev.
Oh no!
Boo!
Yeah, lots of booing. Khrushchev does away with this. Khrushchev unifies the state and the party apparatus. So, in order to participate in the state functions, you had to be involved somewhat with the party. And that does a lot of damage.
Sounds like it almost bureaucratizes things, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Khrushchev heavily bureaucratized everything. All of the things that people accuse Stalin of doing, of like the over centralization and the and the authoritarianism, was really under Khrushchev. Stalin was more about decentralization, if anything. He was probably the most pro-decentralization premier that the Soviet Union ever had. He was all about giving more power to local Soviets and to the Union republics. Khrushchev did away with that.
So basically you're telling me that I've been lied to my whole life.
Yeah.
Whack.
Shocking.
Yeah.
I'm shocked.
Yeah.
You should listen to Proles of the Round Table.
Khrushchev also did away with, as has been mentioned on, I think, 2 previous Proles episodes, made operating a collective farm a lot harder, mostly because he instituted monocropping, which we now, I mean, like, if you go to Iowa now, go see how successful monocropping is there.
Not very.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he also did away with the state-owned agricultural equipment co-ops. So under Stalin, collective farms could rent out machinery for cheap and or free. And they could do it for their work, and then they could return it to the state-run surplus co-op. And that's how that relieved them of a massive cost burden, because that machinery was obviously expensive. So it was more efficient and effective to let the collective farms borrow that machinery for their individual usages and then return it and then just use it as they need it. So Khrushchev did away with those. So now suddenly every collective farm in the USSR has to supply their own heavy machinery, has to supply their own threshers, their own tractors, their own whatnots, and production craters because of this. So like in combination with bad production shifting, with over bureaucratization, like anti-revisionism becomes way more appealing because you can really like see a lot of the basis of these arguments that the USSR under Khrushchev really took a nosedive. Not just in terms of quality of life, but like how democratic living there was. Whereas previously your voice had magnitudes of say in how the state was run. After, like during Khrushchev and after, your voice got minimized and minimized and minimized. And probably the next greatest blow to Soviet democracy was under Brezhnev.
He was the fellow with the eyebrows, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a gold phone, like hairy chest, eyebrows.
Yeah.
Lounging by the pool. Stalin.
I just love to point out those eyebrows. They're amazing.
He basically nerfed the autonomy of the Union republics.
Did you just say nerfed?
Yes.
Rise up. You've been revealed as a nerd.
I make no bones about that. Khrushchev had kind of been whittling this away, but at least under Stalin, the culture and the people of the Union republics were highly valued. Mm-hmm. And measures were undertaken at every point possible to encourage the Union republics to develop their own cultures, to develop their own traditions, to like kind of like foster national identity. Brezhnev encourages the implementation of a new reading of the national question pretty much for the first time since Stalin. And it prioritizes Russia, the RSFSR, over everyone else. And this like was in direct confrontation with Stalin and especially with Lenin. Both of them wrote many, many times about the dangers of great Russian chauvinism and how any sort of union with the Union republics needed to minimize that. And Stalin actually struggled like against this during his tenure. There was an attempt in the late 30s, early 40s, and then again after World War II to move the capital of the RSFSR from Moscow to Leningrad, which would have inflamed like this great Russian chauvinism. And like I don't know if there was necessarily a purge, but there was like a confrontation over that. So even like Stalin was struggling against this. Brezhnev inflamed it. And it's during Brezhnev's tenure that really transforms the Soviet identity from one of proletarian internationalism to Russian nationalism. And that's where Soviet nostalgia now has its very socially conservative and reactionary base, is from Brezhnev's like wrenching to the right of his understanding of the national question from one of, we are internationalist, we are a union of many peoples all in this together fighting for revolution, to Russia plus a bunch of like satellite states. And this does incredible damage to basically the Soviet Union, because what ends up happening in practice is that Russian interests are prioritized again and again and again over those of the Union republics. There was an incident in which the Kazakhstan Communist Party leader was replaced by a Russian at a time when Kazakhs were 40% of the population in their own country.
Right.
So not only were Russians the majority population in Kazakhstan, but the leader of the Kazakh Communist Party wasn't even a Kazakh. He was a Russian. By the time Gorbachev takes office, there's no non-Russians in the Central Committee anymore. They're
Yikes.
all Russians.
It's not good, buddy.
So when we look now at like, well, why is Soviet nostalgia so reactionary? It's because of that. It's because of this like complete destruction of the democratic rights of the Union republics. And just kind of like, I mean, at that point, they did kind of just become satellite states. They lost a lot of their personal power that they had in favor of like this sort of like furthering of Russian identity, which we're dealing with the consequences of now. Latvia just had neo-Nazis marching in the streets a few weeks ago, and that's an after effect of all of that.
Yeah, it leaves all of the Soviet states open to nationalism.
Yeah,
of the reactionary type.
yeah,
And then also, of course, American propaganda, or I guess Western propaganda, which of course would lead in part to the dissolution of
yeah,
USSR.
yeah. So that's kind of like the rise and fall of democracy and democratic processes in the USSR. So now we're going to kind of take a world tour of how democracy is manifested in other places. So the next biggest example is obviously China. The way Chinese democracy works is a little different than how it manifested in the USSR because of mass line. So mass line is a new, quote unquote new, as with everything about quote Maoism unquote.
Oh boy.
I mean,
we're going to get some angry letters.
Gonzalo gang's gonna descend upon us.
look, if I wanted letters from terrorists, I would go like there are Maoists and then there are Maoists. Maoists, like people. So, okay, if we're even going to accept the term Maoist for the purposes of this argument, because it's kind of an anachronism, but that goes beyond the scope of this discussion. A lot of Maoists would point to mass line as like one of Mao's greater contributions to the idea of socialist democracy. Well, there's a counterpoint that mass line is just the idea of Soviet democracy adapted to China, whatever. The idea of mass line is that the program and efforts of the party were informed directly by the masses rather than necessarily other party cadre. What this led to was one of the things that always cracks me up is when people put Maoist as like the most authoritarian type of communism or whatever. Because if anything, Maoism is like almost close to like anarchism. Well, it's not close to anarchism. They're obviously fundamentally different. But like
I've heard it called anarcho-Stalinism.
I mean, it's not wrong. Is the thing. There's like this heavy like emphasis not just on the bottom up kind of idea.
Yeah.
Because like again, commandism is a Maoist term. Maoists really don't like the idea of an all-powerful bureaucracy that just kind of controls everything. But they also don't like ultra-democracy, which in a Maoist analysis, anarchism would probably fall under, where you're just having endless debates and nothing ever gets done. The Maoist balance is mass line, which is the vanguard party is informed directly by the masses. And so using that resource, the party advances that way. What's really interesting, I can't believe I found this on the internet, is the Constitution of the Communist Party of the Philippines, the same Communist Party of the Philippines is currently engaged in a protracted people's war for the last 50 years. Why their constitution is available online is news to me, but it is, and it's from 2016. So it's like, and it was amended at their last party congress. So like, it's the most up-to-date version there is. But it's really interesting because you get to see the structure of a communist party that's currently engaged in an active revolution. And Article 4, Section 1, the structure of the party shall be based on the principle of democratic centralism. Right there. So like even like the Maoists, with their big emphasis on the power of like the everyday person having influence on the direction of the party, still hold to this idea of like democracy, but with leadership, which you would think everyone would get on board with, but no. Other examples, the one that I really wanted to focus on was Venezuela, because it's really, really, really exciting. The latest PSUV Congress, which was this past June. So keep in mind that they're not yet out of the coup stage. They're still dealing with a lot of the after effects of it. The theme of the last PSUV Congress was essentially all power to the communes, which sounds a lot like all power to the Soviets. So I decided to look into how Venezuela's democracy works. And they're also in a revolutionary type of situation, but a different one than the Maoists. They're in this stage of shifting from a bourgeois democracy to a proletarian one. Because now that the coup has subsided, I'm not going to say failed, because God knows from Cuba's example that coups don't fail. They just come back like a Hydra wearing an Uncle Sam hat. That the National Assembly, from whence sprouted Juan Guaido, has basically lost any influence that it once had, because it's basically been openly revealed to have been collaborating with the United States to topple the democratically elected government of Venezuela. And so we're going to see if the Constitutional Convention that has now been convened for 2 years and has kind of been sitting on the sidelines waiting to see what's going to be happening with it, it might finally actually see some power now. And that's really exciting, because that means that the focus of democracy in Venezuela is going to shift from the legislature to the comunas, to these neighborhood like pop-up assemblies. And like you look at how these assemblies are structured, and they are basically like Soviets. They're basically neighborhood assemblies or workplace assemblies or like focused around a certain issue like electricity in a certain neighborhood, like literally anything. It's just a gathering of people, and they file paperwork with the government, and they become an official commune. And there's some like couple thousand of these things all throughout Venezuela, and that may end up becoming the new basis of Venezuela's government in the next few years, which is super, super exciting, because we're essentially going to see the birth of the sixth actually existing socialist state, which I'm personally like really excited for. Again, a lot of this is kind of like up in the air because they're still like recovering from a coup attempt. We're still yet to see the direction that Maduro is going to go. Everything lately has said that he's looking to shift towards a commune-based democracy. We're going to have to see. But
I take democratic socialists a lot more serious if they actively supported Maduro. If they were I believe in communism, but the way we're going to get there is by electing leftist leaders who can push things in that direction.
Oh, don't worry. The DSA is getting their own in a few minutes. So Venezuela, Laos, and China presently all kind of operate under the same principle of a front that then has a dominant party within it. So the idea of the Popular Front manifested in two ways. It manifested in one way in what became the Warsaw Pact countries, where the communist parties would ally with friendly social democratic and liberal parties to form a popular coalition against fascism that then ended up becoming the governing party afterwards. China,
hell yeah.
China, yeah, and it worked and also didn't. That's just the science of things. In China, they also use a Popular Front. The fucking Kuomintang has seats in the Chinese government.
Right.
So, like, they also utilize that Popular Front. Laos does the same, and Vietnam does the same, and so does North Korea, which is in terms of reviewing how democracies work in currently existing socialist states, is our last stop. And like a lot of the same nonsense that we hear about the DPRK is basically repackaged nonsense that we heard about the USSR. Mm-hmm. That you can only vote for one person, that the secret police watch you, and that if you don't vote for the Workers' Party, you get executed. Okay, a lot of these accusations can be disproven with simple logic. Destroyed with facts and logic. For one thing, there's multiple parties with representation in the Supreme People's Assembly. So if people who were voting against the Workers' Party were summarily executed for doing so, that would mean that we would see rapid population decreases in the DPRK like clockwork every 5 years, and we obviously don't.
Sure.
Furthermore, the DPRK's candidate selection operates on a lot of the same basis that the USSR did. Like, there's before the actual election, there's a lot of like pre-discussion, a lot of like candidate selection that goes on within local groups. And then like there's the candidate at whenever you vote. It's not like you just get one candidate and that's kind of it. That's kind of like a projection of how it's like in bourgeois democracies than necessarily anything else. Other than that, the DPRK's system of democracy isn't, I mean, like, legislature-wise, is not terribly different from any other type of parliamentary system that we've seen before. You can actually look up all of the DPRK's electoral statistics on the website of the International Parliamentary Union, which monitors, like, the legislatures of every nation on Earth, including the DPRK's. And you can look and see like how many members there are, what parties they belong to, what percentage of them are women, what percentage of them are young, when their last elections were. Like all of these basic statistics are available for people to read. And like the International Parliamentary Union is not a communist resource. It's like, if anything, like maybe a liberal resource. I
Sure,
actually don't
yeah.
know the political bent of it, but like if they're presenting like the bare bones facts of what the DPRK's voting system is like, you would think it's not hard for people to investigate that shit. But it is.
Yeah,
And so,
of course.
So now we move to the United States.
Let's
Death to
not do that.
Gross.
And kind of like, where do we go? What direction does democracy go
What is to be done?
going forward?
Nice.
We're kind of at it. The way that I personally see it is that we're kind of at a crossroads right now. We're still very much in a pre-revolutionary formation, which is becoming a problem because it's rapidly becoming apparent that it's 1916 and we're still in 1899.
Sad.
Like, if anything, Ferguson and Baltimore were our 1905 revolution, and nothing has changed since then.
Yeah.
Which is terrifying. So, like, we're kind of at this critical crossroads of, like, we need to figure out what we're going to do from here. And every experiment at forming sort of, like, this unprincipled big tent has summarily collapsed. We've seen that kind of with the Marxist Center, about how it hasn't fallen apart yet. Whether it will or not in the near future is left to be determined.
Yeah.
That depends on whether they institute any sort of centralism or they just let member organizations remain completely autonomous. The DSA convention was kind of like a picture perfect capsule of like how not to do inter-organizational democracy, because like this was probably the most important event for the DSA that it's had in a really long time. Mm-hmm. This was the first. It had a convention in 2017, which was like right after the Trump bump. But like 2019 is more like they've had time, they've developed further from 2016. Now we get to see where this organization is at. And I watched that thing live for reasons beyond my personal understanding.
You made a mistake.
And it was from an organizational standpoint, a complete catastrophe. You had, first off, it should serve as the last will and testament of Robert's Rules of Order, which is just about the worst parliamentary procedure on the planet. There's a reason, like, a lot of other groups just use something that's either simplified or something that's completely different, because, like, it was just chaotic. And it was clear that, like, on several occasions, I thought there was going to be like a straight up split in the middle of the live stream. Mm-hmm. Like, I was expecting, like, on the Antifa resolution, I was expecting a walkout. Yeah. I'm amazed that there wasn't one, because that resolution in particular really highlighted for me. I don't think DSA as an organization is a barometer of where the left is in the United States. I personally consider the DSA to be on par with the Mensheviks. Mm-hmm. They're very similar ideologically, they're very similar organizationally. But that resolution debate really encapsulated how much further we have left to go. That there is still like that resolution out of a total convention attendance of about 1,000 people. That resolution only passed by 28 votes, which is just, I mean, like, and it was a resolution basically saying DSA should actually do something material against fascism.
And they barely passed.
And that resolution passed by 28 votes. And the debate that I watched about it really highlighted how factionalized that organization is, and that the like pro quote militant unquote section won, but barely. But there's still a very significant portion of an organization that is ostensibly the largest organization in the United States on the left that isn't really on board with the idea of being militant against fascism.
Right.
And that's a major issue. No, I'm not like, DSA can learn from that. And I really hope they do. Because as weird as this sounds, I feel like there is some hope for DSA, but it's going to take an awakening of almost biblical proportions to finally like get people to realize, you know what, we're not going to trying to wrench the Democratic Party to the left isn't going to work anymore. We need to like actually become our own thing. And I mean, a lot of the problem is a lot of these, the answer to these things is time will tell. But watching that was kind of perfect in like how much like people need to study democratic procedures, not just in practice, like not just how we form, you know, workers' assemblies and how we, you know, I mean, like the anarchists are really taking the mantle from the Marxists in terms of like workers and community assemblies, which is a thing, which has its own host of issues, but like that just kind of serves as a testament as to what we can do better. It's not necessarily that the anarchists are like necessarily doing anything bad. I would argue that there's very few leftists in the United States that have objectively bad intentions. And I'm not going to name names, but I'm sure we can all assume who. It just, we need to learn from these incidences and these mistakes that we've made going forward,
right,
in honing our revolutionary theory about democracy and how we implement that in practice.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to do.
All right. So thank you so much to Colette for coming on tonight.
Of course.
I wanted to thank everyone for listening. There will be some suggested reading in the show notes. Colette, where can people find you online, or do you have any sort of projects that you're developing?
So
which you'll already have heard at this point.
I am hosting by myself for now, the newest member in the Proles of the Roundtable podcast family called Ad Vincere Mundi. It means a world to win in Latin, and it is a podcast looking at classical history from a historical materialist perspective. And the next historical arc that I will be recording is on ancient Palestine, and I will be doing that in collaboration with Jaco from Proles of the Mignon, and that's going to be super exciting.
Hell yeah.
So that's what's going on and what you can look forward to.
All right. Well, our sponsors are all of our excellent fans on Patreon. As always, we have way too many to read each time now, but since the last time we recorded, or the last time we recorded, these are our new ones. Dexter, Evan, Grammar Antifa, Hamish, Isham, James, Josephine, Justin, different one, Lab Pleb, Lynn, Mikey, Nathan, Peter, Robert, Ryan, Taylor, and Trash Hall. All of these people are inspiring and revolutionary and make it easier for us to make this podcast for you and have it sound good. We've established what we're calling the USSP with several child podcasts that we have started centralizing links to the various feeds on our website, so you can check those out. Also, we wanted to thank Ransom Notes for our intro music. Check him out on SoundCloud. Please don't forget to rate and review. Visit prolespod.com. Like us on facebook.com/prolespod and follow us on Twitter @prolespod. If you have any feedback, topic ideas, or suggestions, feel free to send us an email at prolespod@gmail.com or in the comment box on our website. Thanks for tuning in. Solidarity. Forever.
Nice.
Good night.
Good night.